Good afternoon, everyone. Aloha and welcome to Our Homes, Ending the Housing Crisis. I'm today's host, Stanley Chang, and I chair the Hawaii State Committee on Housing. We're joined today by Dr. Cameron Murray, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Henry Halloran Trust at the University of Sydney, where he received his PhD in economics. Currently, he's the chief economist at Fresh Economic Thinking, specializing in property and housing markets, environmental economics, and corruption. You can read his Substack at fresheconomicthinking.com. Dr. Murray recently authored The Great Housing Hijack, which looks at the factors influencing the Australian property market. And today he'll be discussing the lessons learned from studying Australia's housing shortage. He's a very out-of-the-box thinker on housing issues, and like myself, he's an admirer of the Singaporean housing model. So we will have time for question and answer. So members of the audience, you can insert your questions into the Q&A function of the Zoom. And with that, thank you for joining us, Dr. Murray, and please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Stanley, for having me, and thanks everyone for coming along. I'm going to share my screen, but while I'm doing that, I'm going to explain that what I'm going to talk about is not just an Australian story. And as you'll see, I think it's useful quite often to get an outsider's view on housing, because too often we get bogged down in our local politics and we miss the bigger picture. And so this is a chance for some bigger picture thinking on housing and what we expect from it. So there's the book, The Great Housing Hijack. You can find it on Amazon, and fresheconomicthinking.com is where you find me. You can subscribe for free to keep up with my thoughts on housing. So in my prepared presentation here, and I really want you to note your questions down as I go, because I really want to have a discussion. I want to get us thinking better about housing. I think a lot of our housing discussion is very passionate. It's driven by a lot of concern, but a lot of it is storytelling. There's a lot of storytelling on all sides, and it takes a lot of effort to ground what we're looking at in reality, and it takes a bit of detachment. So that's what I want to do, and I want to zoom out, as I said, and I want to sort of sneak in an economics lesson, which I do in most presentations. I like to say fresh economic thinking is about improving the quality of economic debate. So I'm going to squeeze in a couple of lessons about some puzzles and stories on housing supply and where rents come from, and then finish with what do we really want. So this is a brief summary of a few parts that are in my book. So I definitely recommend, if you want a complete view of how I've come to think about what I think about housing, to read The Great Housing Hijack. But for now, why don't we start by zooming out? Why don't we zoom out a little and look at this quote from a celebrity visitor to Sydney who said this: "The number of large homes recently built is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house." Now, that wasn't a comment by Taylor Swift on her Eras tour earlier this year. That was a comment by Charles Darwin in 1836 on his visit to Sydney on the HMS Beagle. Population of Sydney in 1836, less than 20,000 people. So my question then is, was this a housing supply problem? Was this over-regulation? Was it taxes? What was going on then? Are we really missing something if we're focusing on modern causes of housing problems? What about this quote? "The so-called housing shortage, which plays such a great role in the press nowadays, does not consist in the fact that the working class generally lives in bad, overcrowded, and unhealthy dwellings. This shortage is not something peculiar to the present. It is not even one of the sufferings peculiar to the modern proletariat, in contradistinction to all earlier oppressed classes. On the contrary, all oppressed classes in all periods suffer more or less uniformly from it." Geez, it could have been written in the press today. The language is a bit old-fashioned. Well, maybe that's because it's from Friedrich Engels in 1872, talking about the industrial cities of Europe and the housing problems back then in his famous essay, The Housing Question. Why don't we continue? I thought this was a very prescient quote. The United States, it is clear that the squalor and misery everywhere increases as the village grows to the city. It is in the older and richer sections of the Union that pauperism and distress among the working classes are becoming most painfully apparent. If there is less deep poverty in San Francisco than in New York, it is not because San Francisco is yet behind New York in all that both cities are striving for. When San Francisco reaches the point where New York is now, who can doubt that there will also be ragged and barefooted children on her streets? This association of progress and poverty is the great enigma of our times. And of course, that's 1879. One more. And I think this gets us to thinking about economics. It's quite true that the land monopoly is not the only monopoly that exists, but it is by far the greatest of monopolies. It is a perpetual monopoly, and it's the mother of all forms of monopoly. And I think this gets to the real economic issue that is centuries old. Of course, that's Winston Churchill, the British before he was the British Prime Minister in 1909. So we've got this housing concern that has so far lasted 200 years. We have a housing debate today that is essentially dominated by certain vested interests arguing over policy settings that might marginally increase their gains, certain property owners versus everyone else. But what I also find interesting is the detachment of the debate to the economics or to the data. And I'll go through some. Like, my experience is this. I was in Wellington last year. I was told that they had the worst housing situation. I was in Vancouver earlier this year, and they assured me that no, they're the worst in the world there. In Sydney, of course, regularly, I'm told that Sydney is the worst housing affordability. And now, since COVID on the Gold Coast, which is a tourist town, probably reminds people of Hawaii when they visit, near me in Brisbane, so it's about 1,000 kilometers north of Sydney, people say the same thing. No, it's now we're the worst. So as I said, we're often very passionate about these undesirable housing market outcomes, but we need some clear thinking to show why housing markets do what they do and have done for centuries before we jump to solutions. And I think we sort of often miss that part. And of course, this is why I felt the need to write a whole book about the economics of housing. So let's have a quick look here. The ownership rate in Hawaii. This is an outsider's look at the Hawaiian situation. Took this data from Federal Reserve database yesterday, and it looks like Hawaii's been catching up. Home ownership is on the rise. If anything, the trend in the last 40 years is very positive. Again, so as an outsider coming in, everyone says they're the worst. Okay, what metrics are we going to use here? Home ownership, that's a good thing, isn't it? That's rising. Here's the asset price of homes. And I don't like the asset price of homes as a measure of affordability because we don't use the asset price of Apple shares or stocks in Apple as a measure of the price of computers. So we shouldn't measure the asset price of homes as a measure of how expensive it is to occupy them. But if we look at it, it's pretty similar to Texas, right? And similar to the United States generally. And if anything, Texas has outgrown Hawaii in house asset prices for the last decade or two. Okay, maybe things are great there. I don't know. You guys tell me. This is one of my preferred metrics, but it's again very difficult to understand conceptually. Rent to incomes. This is a ratio of median rent to median income. And here, Hawaii's kind of lower. It's better than average across the United States. So either rents are high, but incomes are much, much higher. And not too dissimilar from Texas, the housing wonderland that we all think is vigorously supplying new homes to keep them cheap. I mean, cheap relative to what? Right? Cheap relative to what? So that's my sort of outsider's look. And I emphasize this, and maybe some people are going, oh, yeah, but. I can tell you, every city, everyone has, oh, yeah, but this, we're exceptional, but you're missing something. Okay, everyone's exceptional, but isn't it funny how these patterns repeat over history and repeat in cities around the world constantly and cyclically? I think that's an important perspective that we overlook too often. So there's a couple of points. Now, a lot of the debate at the moment about housing starts with the premise that there aren't enough homes. This is, I think, a problem because in all those cities that I've visited and all those cities that assured me that they haven't built enough homes, they currently have more, bigger, better dwellings per capita than any point in the history of the universe. If there was ever a shortage, it is not today. As Engels said, it's a perpetual shortage. And of course, as Churchill said, well, that's because land's a monopoly, right? You can't just build houses without places to put the houses. It's not a housing problem. It's a places to put houses problem. And there's a class of people that own places to put houses that aren't in the business of making those places worth less money. So let's get a little bit more into those economic, long-term, big picture things that I think we need to understand to make sense of housing. The first question is, why are new homes built? Like, this is a funny thing that I've been studying property for 2 decades, and I actually don't have a good theoretical answer for this quite yet. And do you know what? No one else does either. Anytime someone says to you supply or demand, they're basically saying, I don't know. Supply, oh, people build houses. Why? Because supply. But why? Oh, because they build houses. This is just like a tautology. So there's surprisingly little theory or evidence. And really important point, most analysis of the production of homes confuses density, dwellings per land area, with supply or production, dwellings per period of time. And I'll show you that confusion in a moment. The second puzzle is, where do rents come from? We've got this idea that, oh, if we just supplied homes, rents are 20% of incomes, that would be 10% of incomes, and they would just stay there. And nothing would happen. Okay, that is completely wrong, and I'll explain why. Because the question right now is, why aren't the households living where they're currently living not paying half the price? Right? There's nothing stopping every household from staying exactly where it is today and saying, no, I'm only going to pay half, and all agreeing, right? Isn't there? There's nothing that's stopping them. So why aren't they agreeing, and why isn't it half the price? Why is it what it is? Why is it not double what it is? Right? Where does this come from? We need a theory for this. Why aren't rents already cheap if we have more homes than ever? That's sort of the motivation of this puzzle. So I'm going to sneak in the economics lesson here and see where we get to. The production of homes. So supply is not, when people say supply and demand, they're not explaining an economic theory of production. They're explaining an economic theory of exchange. They're saying, well, for example, if you trade Apple shares, you have a bid curve and a rent curve. That's supply and demand. That's it. It doesn't tell you why people are bidding that much or why anyone's selling. It's not an explanation. All right. We need a better theory of why you would build houses today and not tomorrow. That's the question. We often confuse regulations on density or location with the regulations on the rate of new housing production. So for property owners, it has always been the case, as I was saying, that they will optimize waiting for a future period to build versus building today. That is the trade-off. I mean, the very fact that we can build today places, new houses, means that someone had property they could have built houses on 10 years ago, but chose not to. Why? Why did they choose not to build houses for 10 years? That's the question. So let me just, let me check where I'm going here. So that's the question. And I think it makes more sense with the diagram that I'm going to get to in a minute. So we have this idea in our mind that, oh, if we regulate the density down, so you can only build 10 apartments here instead of 50, that decreases the number of homes by 40, right? Because, of course, you've regulated that site down. But you've got to get the whole picture of the market, right? The number of homes built per period, the supply or the production, is the density of each project, homes per project, homes per land area, multiplied by the frequency of projects per period. And planning, at least in most places I've been, maybe tell me if it's different in Hawaii, does not regulate the frequency or how quickly property owners can choose to build. Not at all. So if they're limited in density to a dozen apartments here instead of 2 dozen, well, they can build 2 projects this year. at a dozen each instead of one, right? And this has penetrated the Australian policy debate. It sounds like it's penetrated the US policy debate, but I really want to emphasize you can build a lot of homes at different densities. Density and supply are different. So here I've got this like sort of two-axis chart just to reiterate. So density is the vertical, so I'm going to put that to the side. The rate of housing production here on the horizontal axis, you can see, I've got detached houses. I've got 4 being produced in a 1-year period here on the left and 8 being built here, right? So the density is not the quantity, it's not the frequency. It's also true that I could have 4 dwellings on one site and build one project this period at a higher density, right? Or 4 houses on different sites at a lower density this period, right? So density, you can build high density, slow or fast across the top, 4 per year or 8 per year at higher density, and you can build low density, slow or fast as well. Okay, and what we often assume is that if you change zoning from low to high density, you're actually not just changing the type of homes, but you're actually changing the frequency. And it's not clear to me that that's true in general. It might be true at a location, but remember, all locations are substitutes. So I think that's the first sort of big idea here, is that density and quantity, density and the rate of production are different. And we've been bogged down that somehow regulations on density are creating a shortage, that's creating the wrong quantity of homes, and we're ignoring all the offsetting, all the what we'd call equilibrium effects, right? High density places are generally expensive. You need high values to build tall buildings, right? We have a lot of situations in Australia where we're zoned for 90-meter tall towers and no one's built one for 30 years because it's not worth doing, right? And everyone still complains that houses are too expensive in those places, right? So just keep that in mind. So that's the first thing. Density and quantity are different, and the quantity, the number per period of new homes built, is a private decision of property owners and has been for hundreds of years. And that's why, this is why the land monopoly or the property monopoly was such historical interest in the 19th century. So that's the first sort of economic puzzle I want to bring to your attention. The second one is about the rent of homes. Okay. There is this popular idea that housing rent should fall over time, like the price of televisions, cars, clothes, etc. Right? There's this idea that the rent is wrong, right? If we look out in the economy, look at, cars get cheaper, clothes get cheaper, but houses keep rising with incomes. And we go, that must be a problem. That must be a market failure. Okay. All right. So let's zoom out and look over time. The ratio of rent to income was pretty flat line that we saw earlier in Hawaii and Texas, pretty flat over 30, 40 years. I'll give you some Australian data from what we do this thing called the Survey of Income and Housing, and I think the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the Census Bureau does a similar thing in the United States. And for renter households, the share of income spent on rent in 1991 was 20%, 20.0 something. In 2021, it was also 20%. And in every census year in between, it was within 1 percentage point. And back in 1911, New South Wales, so Australia only became a country in 1901. In 1911, New South Wales had its first inquiry into rising rents in Sydney. And during that inquiry, the investigators worked out that rents in Sydney were around 20% of household income. So pretty much a flat line for 100 years. The question is why, right? And we need to understand this. If we're going to orchestrate housing policy to make rents cheaper, and we've just looked at, we've got a flat line for 100 years before taxes, before federal income taxes, before taxes on development, before federation of the country, right? Before planning regulations. We should probably have a good theory about that. The theory is this, and it's really surprising that this is not sort of more of the default understanding. Homes have many dimensions: size, location, quality, all within, I wish I could spell and not do typos, all within one dwelling per household. So the point here is if the rent falls in an area for whatever reason, right? Whether someone floods the market, accidentally builds lots of homes, or whether incomes fall, or whether high income people leave, for whatever reason, if the rents fall, you can buy more housing, but still just one home, because you can buy more homes on more quantity of other dimensions like size, location, or quality. And I'll give you an example. Let's go back to the clothing. Let's say you spend $5,000 on 50 clothes items per year. So you spend 5% of your income on clothing. And the price per item of clothes drops 20% to $80 per item. Now, demand slopes down. That's the big lesson in economics. So you'll respond by buying more items, right? Because they're cheaper. If you buy 25% more items, you still spend $5,000, the same 5% share of your income, but you get 62 items, right? So the share of income spent on clothes has stayed constant. You've just got more quantity of clothes, right? So when we're out there looking at houses, clothes, TVs, whatever, we look at the item, but we don't look at the category of expenditure. And the thing is, one house is both a quantity of items in terms of quality and location, and also a category of expenditure all within one building. So if the price of homes falls, you can buy more homes. And we do that, but we typically don't do it by, oh, well, we do in some ways, but we don't do it by having one household with 2 dwellings or 3 or 4. What we do is we move to a better location. So we get more location quantity. We have fewer people per dwelling, so we spread out amongst the dwellings. We have a higher quality dwelling, so we get more like quality items, right? More quality items. Or we get bigger homes, more quantity of building items. And so when all those effects, these equilibrium effects happen, what you see is that, well, rents to income's pretty flat. The way to get rents to go down is get all the rich people to leave, make incomes fall, or make the place a worse place to live so people leave. They're historically the only ways to make rents fall. And in fact, the head of the Reserve Bank of Australia was asked at a parliamentary inquiry 3 years ago into housing, are there any examples of cities that made housing cheap through market reform, from changing planning rules and getting more market supply? And the Reserve Bank deputy governor actually said, our research could find no examples. The only times rents fall is due to macroeconomic disruption and falling incomes. I got a call from the UK Office of Innovation saying, oh, we're looking around the world for examples of cities that made rents cheap with deregulation and planning reform. And I said, well, I don't have any. And they said, no, well, neither do we. That's why we're chasing you, right? We can talk about Auckland if you want. I know Auckland's just hit the zeitgeist these days. So there's some 2 lessons here. No matter what you do, rents are going to be 20% of income. They've been 20% of income for hundreds of years. They've gone up and down with the cycle, but it's essentially a flat line. So what's the real problem and where are we? So my personal story, I used to believe all these contradictory ideas about housing and property markets with absolutely no cognitive dissonance. I believed when I used to work at a property developer, a publicly traded property developer here in Brisbane. And I would believe the stories about how if you just get off our back and let us build what we want, we'll make houses affordable. But then when I went back to the spreadsheets and did my feasibility, I'm like, oh yeah, prices will probably go up. Rents will do this. Totally ignored this thing that we said was the huge effect. Oh, we're going to flood the market and make houses cheap. And then in our feasibility go, no, houses aren't getting cheap. I'm like, well, which is it? Because when the money's on the line, we assume that's not going to happen. But when we're talking over breakfast with politicians, we tell them that's the biggest thing that's going to happen. And it took me a long time to realize that we tell these stories to avoid issues around the monopoly of land, and that the real problem is this distribution of who has access to land and how they get it. And this is why historically it's, the problem of the proletariat, not just in the present, but at all times, even in the industrial cities of Europe. So for me, okay, so let's get down to the final details. What's the real problem? Household incomes do not rise evenly. And when there is a big economic change, some people's households' incomes do not keep up. And that means geographically they get squeezed into inferior locations. So it's a story of unequal competition for locations. This is why this Henry George story of progress and poverty is, well, when there's a big economic boom, incomes rise a lot. Do you know what doesn't happen? Everybody's income doesn't rise proportionally. Because if that happened, there wouldn't be a problem, right? But because incomes don't rise proportionally, we've got this sort of tournament economy of competition for locations, and someone has to lose, right? In a tournament economy. So generally, we deal with this problem with home ownership, right? Pre-Second World War, home ownership in Australia was something like 45%. We got it up to 70% in the early 1970s. And do you know why home ownership is the solution to that problem? Because you get rent controlled. Your landlord doesn't keep putting your rent up on you if local incomes rise and demand for your location increases. Your landlord regulates your rent at a fixed price at the time that you buy it. Now, people hate that home ownership is the ultimate rent control, but it gives you all those benefits, right? So that's one way to deal with it. That's why property owners don't want rent control, right? If rent control, this is sorry, it's a bit of a quick sidetrack. People go, oh, rent control will backfire and make rents more expensive. Oh, so property owners and landlords should lobby for rent control because they want rents to be higher, but they don't. Are they crazy? What's going on? They lobby against it because it works, right? That's why they don't want them. And I find it very, very puzzling that property owners go, oh, no, we're going to supply lots of homes and make rents fall. And that's good. We want that. Okay, can we just regulate your rent to be lower with a rule rather than regulate rent to be lower through some new competitor? Oh, no, we don't want that. Oh, so do you really want rents to be lower, or are you just pretending? So this is just a quick chart. I really want your questions. So just to wrap up where all this leads me at the end of the day, this is the rent to income ratio for Australian renters in the 2019-2020 survey. It's about 5,000 data points there. So the rent to income ratio is on the vertical, household after tax income on the horizontal weekly. Blue dots are employee households, yellow dots are pensioners and welfare recipients. And we can see that, yeah, for a lot of these employees, rent to income ratio is really low. They're all doing fine. Even this middle bulk here, it's actually just a small pocket, right, of people, often pensioners and welfare recipients and low income households that are really struggling. And you've got to imagine this curve over time shifting. You've got to imagine all these little dots moving and competing for each other when incomes rise unevenly. And that is, I think, where the big disruptions are. Okay. So what do we really want? I don't think politically we want the market price of homes to be cheap, because when that starts happening, we take extreme actions to reverse that, right? During COVID, everyone thought the housing market would fall, builders would collapse. We bailed everyone out with cheap mortgages. In Australia, we subsidized home construction to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, and the reality is homes are worth a lot. I don't know what the US market's worth, but Australia's worth $11 trillion, and the 3 million landlords earn about $60 billion per year in income. And by the symmetry of property markets, there's a loser for every winner from lower prices. Dollar for dollar, cheap rents mean lower returns for landlords, every dollar. Okay, so there's a political tension here. So if we don't want the market price of homes to be cheap, what do we want? Maybe we want more homeowners. Okay. But then if we make more homeowners, do we then want their values to fall? We've just got them all into home ownership, and then we've wiped trillions off their most valuable asset. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe we just subsidize people in and try not to manipulate the price. Or, and this is where I get to in my conclusion, do we let the housing market do what it does and offer low-priced alternatives for just those few households that are really being squeezed? And we do this with public school. Most countries do it with public healthcare. And we choose this second option for the military. We have defense housing in Australia. If soldiers need cheap places to live, we just have an authority that builds cheap houses in those places and lets them rent. We do it for public officials. In ski towns, resort owners do cheap staff housing because they're not going to manipulate the price of the city down. And that's where I end up with. If you want cheap housing, you've got to just do it directly for those groups within the market. And I think Singapore is a good example. A very brief summary. Singapore is quite different because it's universal. right? Use residency, age requirements. There's also relationship and race requirements in certain uh, here. So it's sort of universal. And it's a below market option with a parallel resale market. And it's kind of similar to how central banks work, right? The government guarantees elastic supply of money at an interest rate to regulate the interest rate in money markets. The central bank does that. And a housing system has an elastic supply of subsidized homes at that fixed cheap rate. And that's what they do. They have 99-year leases. The point about these leases and land acquisitions, I actually don't think they're a huge deal because the economic cost of subsidies is the difference between the market price and the subsidized price. And we can copy Singapore without copying the physical shape. So this is what a new housing estate in Singapore looks like. It doesn't have to look like that, right? You can copy the economic design with townhouses, detached homes, whatever you want. This is what happened after Singapore's independence. Home ownership boomed from 20-something% to 80-something% through this system. Australia's home ownership in metropolitan areas went from the mid 40% up to 70% with publicly run housing schemes and rent to purchase schemes as well. So that's how we did it historically. That's where I end up. If you want people to have cheap homes, you get the people that are having issues, which is a small fraction of the market, and you subsidize them into homes. If you don't want to do that, then maybe it's not clear what you want in housing. So thank you. I really appreciate questions. I don't have a clock I can see, so I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Murray. And you can submit your questions through the Q&A feature of the Zoom. I'll just get things started by asking one question to begin with. So there are a number of jurisdictions that we're familiar with here in the country of the United States. Many are in the Sun Belt, places like Houston or Atlanta or Nashville, Florida, Texas, Nevada, Arizona, where housing supply does appear to keep up with demand and has done so for many years, basically entirely through private sector construction. And many folks in this country have pointed out that these jurisdictions have lower amounts of land use regulation. And conversely, jurisdictions with high housing prices like a San Francisco or a Honolulu have high amounts of land use regulation. So clearly the answer is to deregulate land use in these high cost jurisdictions in order to make them more like the lower cost jurisdictions in like the Texases and Floridas. What do you agree with that? And if not, why not?
Not really. There's a couple of reasons. Firstly, housing issues in big cities have essentially been the same for centuries prior to any land use regulation. And I think there's a lot of our concern comes from the inequality when you get large clusters of people in big cities. You attract people all up and down the distribution. Now that you can deal with that by reducing inequality. You can deal with that by spreading people out. So I think a lot of the Sunbelt cities, it's just like, well, yeah, if you can live far away from everyone else, it doesn't really matter if there's income inequality at a location because you're all just spread out everywhere. And secondly, if you've got this long-term story that these cities can supply lots of homes cheap, well, people do move there, but not as many as you would think if it's such a success, right? There's nothing stopping people in other cities moving there to take advantage of this. So there's got to be some kind of trade-off of quality of life that a lot of people don't want to make, right? I guess another way of putting that is bad places to live are always cheap, right? Because cheap places to live, if they're good, don't stay cheap because anyone can move there. So we have this term spatial equilibrium in economics, right? Because people can move locations, you can't have cheap, good places to live because people will move there. There's got to be something stopping that happening. So I think it's a bit of that. Secondly, incomes are a lot lower in these Sunbelt cities, right? a lot lower than the sort of northern coastal cities. And you've got to take that into account as well, right? And people mix this up with Japan. They go, "Oh, look how cheap Japan is." I'm like, "Do you know how much money people make in Japan?" You can't just compare your California income to a Tokyo income and say houses are cheap, right? You gotta understand that if you move there, you're in their labor market also, as well as their housing market. So I think we miss all this. Now it's true that they're growing really quickly, but what I find interesting is that it doesn't seem to matter whether a city is growing or not growing to how the conversation is had. So in Sydney in the 2010s, they doubled the rate of housing production and they still said, we got a housing shortage, no one's building houses. I'm like, just look at this chart. In Ireland in the 2000s boom, they said, we got a housing shortage, no one's building housing. They literally, yeah, almost every second adult male is working in housing construction. So it's, and then you've got places that have no housing construction go, oh, they're fine because no one wants to live there. So my experience when I look broadly is that there's not really a correlation that fits um, over time between concerns about shortages in building versus what is actually happening on the ground. Um, yeah, that's my answer.
Okay, great. We do have several questions in the chat already, starting with one from Akana Hicks. There's a big push for upzoning in the Anglosphere, nominally to support lower home prices. There's a simultaneously, though arguably less successful, push for public housing a la Singapore. Is there a tension there in that if a public developer has to acquire land for public housing, the public developer will pay a higher price if that lot has more options attached, or I
Yeah.
guess is more desirable in some way, perhaps because of the greater amount of density permitted?
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it depends on the location, where, and it depends if planning is binding on density. But it's true that you know, if you upzone and then acquire homes, you might have to pay more to the current private landowner for that, and that's sort of true. But there are many ways around this, right? So the Dutch have a procedure called active land policy, and they acquire agricultural land at agricultural prices, and then once it's owned by the city, they do their upzoning and their city planning to create the new suburb. They build the roads, the dikes, the windmills, whatever they need, right? And then once it's subdivided and you know, parceled up into city lots, then it's sold with new planning requirements. Oh, we're having a mixed use center here. We're having this, right? Now you guys go and work it out. And they used to make a lot of money on that during the 2000s boom. They sort of slowed down after the financial crisis because the cities were left holding these massive property assets. And right, property is a leveraged, you know, undeveloped property is a leveraged exposure on the housing market. So, you know, if the housing market falls 20% and land's half the value of the home, the land falls 40%, right? So, but they've restarted doing that. So you can actually, you know, do it in a way that those gains are sort of collected by the state. We have examples in Australia. So the ACT is a good example. That's where Canberra is, the Australian capital. It was incorporated in 1911 as a new territory for the new capital city. They have 99-year leases there, but again, that's just kind of record keeping. Some of those have expired now, and you can get another 99 years for $260 administration fee. So that's kind of a perpetual, right? But in Canberra, all the land is subdivided by the public housing developer, right? Because all the land was owned by the state, and all the undeveloped land is still owned. And what's interesting is I spoke to the chief of staff of one of the ministers there about 8 years ago when I was doing a research project. And I said, I don't get why you're doing this subsidized housing scheme. Why don't you just sell new blocks of land and apartments at a cheap price? You own them, you can sell them to whoever you want. Like the subsidy is the subsidy. And he said to me, oh, yeah, well, we know we could do that, but we wouldn't want to flood the market and devalue people's homes. I'm like, okay, so you actually don't want the market price of homes to come down. Okay, got it. But the interesting thing about that process is that the territory government there makes something like $270 million per year in profits from their land subdivision, right? So it's a massive, massive earner of income because they acquired the land a long time ago. We find that in defense housing as well. The longer they own the land, right, the more money they make. So yes, it's true that upzoning, you don't want to go upzone and then acquire land. You want to acquire land and then upzone. That's also true of transport infrastructure investments. You want to acquire the land around it before you build the new train station. And that's what's happening in Victoria, in Australia, near Melbourne, a little right now, sort of the Hong Kong model of owning the property and the retail and getting those rents from that public investment of the rail. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to not just do public housing, but also give away a lot of value to private landowners. So you just have to see what's politically and legally workable in your jurisdiction. I think that's the answer.
Next question from Galen Fox is about public housing. So in the US, we built public housing during the Great Depression for lower income people, but it's been viewed as a classic failure and many big projects have been demolished. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, we had the same here. It was quite interesting, right? Because in the 1950s, public housing was very suburban, lots of detached homes, kit homes. We literally have apartments on Sydney Harbour still that are public housing from the 1950s. So there are people in Balmain and Manly, which are essentially the cheapest private apartment. There's $1 million, who are renting a public dwelling from the public housing provider for something like $600 a month, right? So that's about $400 a month. And, you know, everyone thinks they're the greatest things ever. And in fact, they think they're so great, we should privatize them and get the cash, right? So it's a choice. It's a political choice to do bad public housing or good public housing, right? So I always say, well, the Prime Minister has 2 public housing dwellings, and we spent $19 million renovating one of them in 2017. So can we do it or can we not do it? So I agree the sort of 70s tower blocks of what you'd call clustering poverty into public housing just sort of relocated all the poor people who were in other poor private suburbs into poor apartment towers. Definitely, I think the logic of mixing geographically low-income people to, build those social networks with middle-class people in their neighborhood is highly valuable. And I think everyone's aware of that. But we can do it. It's just a choice of whether we do it. So your question, though, Makana, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name, is there a tension? I don't. Oh, sorry, Galen. We built public housing for our special poor people. Yeah. So actually, I explain in the book how there was a big push from private landlords in the big cities in the United States to not take middle class customers away from them, and that's why poor public housing had to be poor quality, not competing, not the same standard as private housing, because there's this, oh, you're going to take all my customers. Sorry, that's not a New Deal thing. You don't get to take my customers. So I think that's important to understand. So here's the funny tension, right? So in Australia, the developer lobby, the housing lobby says, no, we just got to deregulate. Then we will build more to collapse the prices. Don't you get it? So our Greens party announced at a breakfast property developer forum that they're doing a brand new their policy is brand new federal housing developer that's going to compete with them and offer low cost public housing universally. And they all laughed and said, you can't do that. Who's going to build it? You can't just supply your way to cheap housing. And he's just like, you just told me you would do it. Now you're saying it's impossible. Pick one. So you've got to understand the pleading and all that will be to get any effective public alternative to be undermined. And that's sort of the history of public housing in the United States as well. That, if it was really good, the private property owners would lobby against it. That's the sort of thing you got to keep your eye out for.
So do you think that dynamic is the reason why public housing and social housing have have been less successful in recent years than upzoning and deregulation and the essentially libertarian perspective. I mean, Singapore's been hiding in plain sight since the 1960s, Vienna since the 1920s. These are not, there's nothing new about those housing models. And yet they
Yeah.
don't seem to have gotten the traction that upzoning or deregulation has.
Yeah. Well, I mean, makes sense to pool your resources, create property industry groups, and make sure that that's not the topic of conversation, and that allowing your members to buy cheap land, get public investments in infrastructure and upzoning for free, kind of makes economic sense, right? I definitely think there's a lot of rent seeking and political capture at play, for sure. It's sort of, I would say that the US has similar tensions in public healthcare, right? Pharmaceuticals and private insurers, everyone knows, right, that they don't have an interest in a public health option. They don't have an interest in being forced to bargain with um, state buyers for discounted pharmaceuticals. They don't have an interest in off-patent sort of alternatives. And we know it there, but in housing, we sort of pretend that the developers, they're kind of good guys, right? They wouldn't sabotage everybody. They wouldn't manipulate the debate in their own interests. But I think that's definitely the case. And you can see as soon as you say, hey, okay, you guys want the same thing we do, lots of cheap housing built, it doesn't seem to be happening. Why don't we just do some just in case? Just as an insurance policy, we'll just flood the market a little bit, or we'll do this. You watch them change their mind on a dime. No. So that's been my experience. Yeah.
So one other
We,
source of, or one other major obstacle to flow. Oh,
sorry, go.
okay. I think we just had a glitch there, but looks like you're back. So one other obstacle that a lot of people talk about are increasing construction costs.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that's a major obstacle to producing a lot of new low-cost supply?
Uh, well, not really. I mean, we actually don't have a construction cost crisis, right? You can buy demountable, portable caravans or something. We have a place to put houses crisis, right? I think that's really important to remember. Caravans cost exactly what they cost, but you know what? We actually have a caravan housing crisis because all the caravan parks keep charging more money for spaces to put them, right? And they keep redeveloping because there's higher value uses of those spaces. So yes, it's of course true it's expensive to build construction. It's of course true that that has increased globally in the last 2 years. Um, it's also important to recognize that construction costs are predominantly the incomes of construction workers also, right? So you can definitely get construction costs down by having a lot of poor people, right? And maybe that makes housing cheap because everyone's poor, but it's not because of the construction cost itself. And you got to, the other thing about construction cost is that it rises with density, right? So if construction costs go up, then maybe lower density becomes more optimal at that point in time, because the extra cost of going up at a higher, per man hour rate is too much. So I don't think it's in general true. We are in a bit of a adjustment period of construction costs globally, but it won't persist, right? It's a sort of short once-off adjustment. And I'll give you an example of the 2010s in Australia. So we had a massive housing construction boom in the 2010s that peaked in around 2016, 17. And construction costs were very cheap and everyone just stopped building because we built so much that rents weren't going up, prices weren't going up, and everyone's like, well, we can't keep building into a market that's not, got a lot of growing demand, so we'll stop. That wasn't because of construction costs. That was, in fact, just about the opposite, right? People's incomes weren't rising and rents weren't going up, so people stopped building. So, yes, it's sort of an issue today in 2024 and a bit of an issue last year, but we can smooth out those projects over the next few years when construction costs aren't rising.
What do you think about the argument that new construction, which may be expensive, will filter down and become less expensive as they age?
Yeah. So the filtering, it's funny, right? You'd think I'd be all over this, but the filtering um, argument or debate is an odd one. So basically, the argument is this: if you build more homes, someone will live in them. Someone or is already a human, therefore they're already living somewhere else. Therefore, they vacate wherever they're currently living, and over time, everyone reorganizes into the housing stock that physically exists. Okay, yeah, I mean that's always true. It's always true that whatever houses exist, we will reorganize into them. So I think filtering is a little bit, it sort of opens up an uncomfortable conversation about the degree to which our housing concerns are just pure wealth and income inequality concerns. Because it's possible for lots of new homes to be built, and only the top half of households get the benefits of filtering because only they have the wealth and income, right? To have fewer houses per person, more quality homes, those effects I was talking about in the rental equilibrium. And you can still have this bottom strata of wealth and income where nothing changes. So, yeah, on average, we build more homes and everyone's spreading out into them and it looks great. But then if these people are compressed in their wealth and income so that they can't sort of move up and take advantage of it, well, is that a housing issue or an income inequality issue? Right. So I think the filtering thing is a little bit like one side of the debate wants filtering to be the process by which property markets fix inequality, right? But they don't really know that that's what they're assuming it does. And the other side is that so they're instead saying, no, it's just a supply story. It's an aggregate quantity supply story, which is true in the aggregate. And the other side is saying, oh no, you're saying filtering fixes inequality, but it doesn't. And so I think they're right. It doesn't, right? But they're right that yes, on average across the market, more homes must be shared amongst the people who exist. I think the important point about filtering is there's this assumption that supply just happens, right? Oh, are you still with me? There's this assumption that supply just happens by itself, and therefore this supply just gets pumped out and filtered. But of course, supply itself, I like to say housing is built to order. Property owners don't just supply homes, they supply when someone demands a home and buys one and orders one. Right. So filtering is not going to happen by someone panic building and just flooding the market. It's not like we have the conversation in Australia. The property lobby calls it banananomics, right? Because we grow a lot of bananas in North Queensland, and the property lobby says it's like bananas, right? You get good season, lots of bananas, price falls because there's a lot of supply of bananas. And I say it's not like bananas. You can accidentally have a good banana season. You can accidentally have none because there was a cyclone, but you don't accidentally build homes, right? You build to order. So I think the filtering is a little bit of a distraction, right? Like, yeah, filtering's happened for 2 centuries. Filtering happened before planning regulations. Filtering happens in every city. Do you know what? Every city for the last 200 years have had the same, housing concern. The ones that solved it don't just say, yeah, filtering did it. They say, oh, low income households. Well, it's a distributional problem as well. Why don't we give them a bit of a cheap home? I think that makes more sense to me.
Okay, and looks like we only have a few minutes left, so we'll take one last question from Donna Wong. Have you found that the more incentives that are given to developers, uh, cheaper construction costs and cheaper?
Um, the short answer is no. So there's this sort of, I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at, Donna, but I'll give you sort of two interpretations. Firstly, is um, I'm going to subsidize a developer. I'm going to give you a tax break to build a home. So the conversation in Australia we've had recently is, well, we should do land tax discounts for corporate landlords who do build to rent projects. I guess my question would be, well, if you gave De Beers diamond monopoly a tax break, would the price of diamonds come down? or are you just giving them money, right? Because they still have an interest in keeping the price where it is. So in terms of pure subsidies, incentives for building, I'm not really sure that works. There's actually a really interesting recent paper that said that showed when for subsidized housing development, essentially crowded out one for one developers' other projects. So they basically said, "Oh, we've got all this portfolio of projects." I think it's Evan Mast or someone, one of those US young researchers. He looked at the portfolio of properties of these developers, and then there was a subsidy scheme, and they all just said, "Oh, well, we'll do the subsidized one first instead of the other one." Right? They just shifted that one up instead, got the subsidy, off they go, which makes economic sense, right? So I don't know why it's so surprising. The other way to subsidize, we did this in Australia during the financial crisis, was we had a thing called a home builder grant. And essentially, if you spent over $100,000 on a renovation or a new construction project, the government would just give you 50,000, 20,000, whatever the number was, in cash to build homes. Did that make housing cheaper? Unfortunately, it made it worse because there was this flood of demand for home builders right after COVID, when supply chains were disrupted. It was hard to import materials and building fittings and transport things. So essentially, it made construction costs go up more. So a lot of people found that they sort of spent more than the $20,000 subsidy purely on rising construction costs because everyone tried to renovate all at the same time. And I think this is another thing, just to sort of wrap up. Remember, we're not going to make homes cheap by changing the number of homes built in the private market. Okay. We can do that. It's great. It's great that the market can be more efficient at building homes, but part of efficiency is also building them at the right time. And that might mean waiting. It might be better to build in 10 years a high rise instead of a mid rise today for a property owner. So there's an efficiency argument for that as well. So the market does that very well. If we want to make homes cheaper, we're also doing that, taking that political risk with all the property owners in the market. The property problem today is a very small slither of the households, and we can offer them non-market alternatives and subsidize them without having to try and outbuild, these economic effects. Because the reality is, for example, Australia has built more housing per capita than just about any city in the last 20 years, any country, right? Nearly 1 in 10 people work in housing construction, right? It's like 10% of GDP. And so if you want to double that rate, you've got to take 10% of people working somewhere else and shift them into housing construction, right? If you want to triple it, you've got to take 20% of every single worker in the economy and shift them from what they're doing now into housing construction. And of course, it's kind of possible. Ireland did it for a few years in the 2000s, when it turns out half of the Polish men aged under 30 were working in construction in Ireland. But, it's not something you can keep up with. And it's not something that unfortunately changes the price too much. I think I was mentioning the other day, if prices in Hawaii get cheap, more people will move there. So, the market, you got to think about the market more broadly. Again, that's the sort of, that's the trick here. The solutions that seem to have worked in the last 200 years involve subsidizing a segment of households in big wealthy cities where low-income people have a lot of trouble in that tournament economy competing for spaces. And they involve letting the market do what the market does and trying not to somehow orchestrate lower prices. So I think that's all I've got to say. Thank you.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for a lot of thought-provoking insights, and definitely different angles from the usual talking points that we hear in the housing discourse. So we really appreciate you joining us today, Dr. Murray, and we hope you'll come visit us in Hawaii in the near future.
Would love to. Thank you so much for having me. Terrific questions today. Thank you all.